Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into a really fascinating piece of history, a 1958 investigation by Rene A called Foundations, Their Power and Influence. Wormser was the top lawyer for a special congressional committee, and what his investigation uncovered about the hidden power of tax-exempt foundations, well, it's pretty eye-opening. So let's start with this question right here, because it's really at the heart of everything we're about to look at. This isn't just about charity or giving money away. It's about who gets to decide which ideas get a megaphone and which ones don't. Who's setting the agenda for our society? To get a sense of the scale we're talking about, back in the 1950s, the combined capital of America's major foundations was around $9 billion. I mean, that's an almost unimaginable amount of money for that time. Just a huge pool of financial power sitting in the hands of a very, very small group of people. But here's the twist. The heads of these foundations, like H. Rowan Gaither from the Ford Foundation, would often say, hey, look, our donations are just a tiny drop in the bucket of total American giving. And he was right. It was less than 3%. So that raises a huge question. How could such a small slice of the pie have so much influence? Well, as Wormser's investigation found, it's not about the total amount of money, it's about how and where that money is strategically aimed.
Okay, so to really get that, we have to start with the why. Why were these massive foundations created in the first place? The investigation found that the motivations weren't always as simple as they appeared on the surface.
What Wormser argues is that, early on, a lot of this was about genuine philanthropy. But as income and estate taxes got higher and higher, the game completely changed. Suddenly, foundations became this incredibly powerful tool for the super-rich to avoid massive tax bills and, this is the really crucial part, to keep control of their family fortunes for generations, capital that otherwise would have been taxed and broken up.
So if it's not just about throwing money around, how did this influence actually work? The Reece Committee, which Wormser worked for, uncovered what it described as a highly concentrated and interconnected web of power. At the center of this web were a handful of absolute giants, they called the Big Six. We're talking Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, you know the names. In 1953, just these 6 foundations controlled nearly $2 billion. They really formed the core of this whole influential network. And one of the key ways this network operated was through something called interlocks. Now, what does that mean? It's basically when the same handful of powerful people sit on the boards of multiple organizations. So you'd have the same person on the board of the foundation giving out the money and on the board of the research institute or university that's receiving the money. It creates this powerful, self-reinforcing echo chamber.
And this wasn't just a theory, they found concrete examples. Get this. In 1953, the same H. Rowan Gaither we heard from earlier was the president of the Ford Foundation. And at the exact same time, he was the chairman of the Rand Corporation. And guess what? The year before, his foundation gave his corporation a cool $1 million. You can see how that works. Now, this web of influence gets even clearer when we look at what Wormser believed was its #1 target, shaping American education and social science. A core argument in the book is that these foundations were huge promoters of something called scientism. This is the idea that you can solve social problems the same way you solve an engineering problem. Just collect the data, find the right formula, and fix society. It pushed a kind of social science that treated things like morality and tradition as outdated ideas that could be changed based on the facts gathered by, you guessed it, foundation-funded experts.
And you know, it didn't always take a billion-dollar grant to have a huge cultural effect. The investigation discovered that sometimes relatively small grants could have an absolutely massive impact. Wormser points to the Rockefeller Foundation's funding for Dr. Alfred Kinsey's famous and very controversial sex research as a perfect example of how a pretty small investment could spark enormous social change.
This is one of the most stunning parts of the investigation. This is not someone's opinion about the report. This is a direct quote from a social studies report for teachers, paid for by the Carnegie Corporation. It literally says that in the society they're building, individual property rights will be altered and abridged. It's right there in black and white.
And just to be absolutely clear, that wasn't just Wormser's interpretation. After looking at all this material, the official congressional committee itself concluded that this Carnegie-funded report was, in effect, a blueprint for a socialist America, and it was designed to be taught in our schools.
So this influence, Wormser argued, went way beyond the classroom. It was aimed at shaping national policy and America's place in the world, pushing a very specific and what he saw as a very radical global worldview.
Here's another major project, also heavily funded by Carnegie. An American Dilemma by a sociologist named Gunnar Myrdal. This book became incredibly influential, and it was deeply critical of the U.S. Constitution, even framing its creation as basically a plot against the common people.
So then Wormser asked this incredibly provocative question. He points out that a former Supreme Court justice had openly complained that the court was starting to cite Myrdal's sociological work in its rulings instead of actual legal precedent. For Wormser, this was a smoking gun, proof that these foundation-funded ideas were making their way to the very highest levels of American law.
The investigation also dug into how foundations like the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace were spending millions to promote internationalism. They funded hundreds of clubs on college campuses, they sponsored speakers, all pushing a worldview that critics like Wormser saw as a direct attack on national sovereignty, pushing instead for global governance.
And all of this leads to the central, most critical conclusion of Wormser's entire investigation. This immense power that foundations have operates almost completely outside of any public or democratic control.
Here they are, some of the official findings from the Congressional Committee's final report. They concluded that this foundation network, through its control of the purse strings, could basically steer public thought. They could fund the scholars and projects that fit their worldview and simply starve out anyone who dissented.
Ultimately, what Wormser is arguing here is that the foundation's network of influence across media, universities, and even government, it created this kind of protective shield around them. It made it almost impossible to have an honest, objective critique of what they were doing because they had influence over the very channels you'd use to make that critique. And that's our deep dive into this incredible investigation. You know, the Reece Committee raised these fundamental questions about power, about philanthropy, and about accountability in a democracy. And decades later, those same questions are still being fiercely debated. Which really leaves us with one final thought. How does this critique from 70 years ago about concentrated and unelected power resonate today?